Angelica, why don't you start with an introduction of the Otolith Group, what you do and why you do it.
So, hi there. We are the Otolith Group. That's myself, Angelica Sagar, and Kojo Eshin. And we inaugurated the idea of the Otolith Group in 2002 in response to a work that we made called Otolith 1, which was a film commissioned by the Arts Catalyst in London, an organisation, to take artists into zero gravity with the Russian Space Agency and respond to microgravity as a kind of site of exploration for cultural practices. And so we made a work there, which is our first film basically, or second film. The first film was the manifesto film. And we discovered that otoliths are little crystals that sit on your inner ear that guide your sense of orientation and balance in the world. And in order to maintain balance and orientation, one needs to kind of have their gaze on a horizon of some kind. And so when floating in microgravity, I made sure to keep my eye on a line in the plane in order to, prevent nausea. So we wanted to, I think, after 9/11 and what we knew was going to happen to the world after that event, we felt that we wanted to think with this device of a kind of orientation stone in the ear that would help us kind of release ourselves from just our humanness, human history, human culture, and think of ourselves more as oriented bodies, or bodies that produce orientations, and think about, the idea of microgravity as a way to think off-world as well as on-world, within the world. So that's a brief kind of background to the term Otolith. But the idea of the Otolith Group, as opposed to ourselves as singular individuals, like Fishley and Weiss or Gilbert and George, who actually lived up the road from me at the time, or whoever else. We called ourselves the Otolith Group. Actually, the inspiration of the group, the idea of the group came from bands, the idea of, being in a band of some kind, kind of failing as a musician and wanting to be in a band, but then, being able to kind of recreate the idea of a group as a band in a way. And also in excess of ourselves as individuals, but also in response to the kind of history at that time of many different new media groups, be they bands, be they film documentary groups. Across the country, documentary and experimental documentaries were being made by lots of different groups. In walks Saatchi with all his money and creates, the YBA movement, the Young British Artists movement, with Tracy Emin and Damien Hirst and all these characters. And it just seemed very at odds with the, everything that had happened prior to that, which were a kind of number of collectives basically, kind of making all kinds of different work. And so obviously this marked a kind of neoliberal moment. So we kind of responded to the idea of this by creating the Otolith Group as a way to think beyond ourselves and to be able to think with others.
And the medium with which you're most deeply associated is not just the moving image, but the film essay in particular, right? Or the essay film, the essayistic film. Could you just, briefly talk about your investment in a term of the essay? Or the film essay?
I mean, do you want to do that?
Yeah, I think the essay film offers the opportunity to, first of all, suspend the distinctions between creation, that which artists do, and then criticism, that which critics do, and then curation, that which curators do. There's a certain indeterminacy in the essay film, which we like. It's not clear whether it's creation, criticism, or curation. In fact, it's floating between all of those three qualities. So that's what we like. Because a lot of our work is to do with studying other works by older artists from different geographies and responding to that work. So there's a kind of analytical dimension, and the essayistic allows for that. So it's a work of thought imagined through editing. It's not necessarily or only about going out into the field and, you know, documenting this or that or filming this and that. It's a lot of sitting at the desk, looking at images and sounds, and working out how to use images and sounds to talk about images and sounds. And that's what we like. That's kind of how we learn about what it is we're doing. And that's a thread running through a work called Otolith Group, which is an analysis of an unmade film by Satyajit Ray. It's there in our work on the poet Tel Adnan. It's there on our work on the group Cadona, and I would argue it's also at play in the new work, Mascon.
Mm-hmm. About which we want to hear more, of course. So, just kind of recount for us the genesis of Mascon, a massive concentration of Black experiential energy.
Well, it all began a long time ago. No, it all began with, obviously a love of parallel cinema in India, a love of experimental cinema in Japan, and a love of the similar movement of cinema in Senegal with two figures, Neubauer Mambety and Sembene, whose work we've always admired, and for all kinds of reasons. When we were asked to make a response to project a Black planet at the Art Institute of Chicago, it seemed very clear to us that you cannot focus on purely the paintings or a kind of document-oriented visual culture of the continent, because I learnt when we curated the exhibition on Chimurenga in London, who are a group from Cape Town, who were looking at flows of connection in the continent between different countries and communities. They were looking at oil, FIFA. They were looking at all kinds of different contemporary flows of connection that kind of replace a sort of Pan-Africanism in the contemporary sense. But also they were looking at a kind of historical and putting these two worlds into relation through their graphics and through their print material that we were exhibiting. There's a lot you can discover on their work online, so I'll leave it at that. But, their work, the signature of their work is that they have a library, a very brilliant, a great library, the Chimurenga Library. And they came to see us and they said, well, you also have a library. You don't really need us. And Tony and Jabi said that. And so, but what they taught me was the fact that, you cannot think of the continent of Africa without thinking of music, and you cannot think about it without thinking about cinema or film, especially now because so much is digitally distributed amongst young people. So, we've always made moving image works, but this was a challenge. Okay, they didn't necessarily want that many moving image works in that exhibition. So I thought, well, why don't we think about a pantheon of forces that might emerge from cinema on a screen. And some friends of ours in Norway, Annette Bush and her colleagues, we've been doing a project with them called Women on Aeroplanes. Again, a project we all co-curated in London on women's participation in African liberation movements. And they are real cinephiles, so they had a number of different films. They had hundreds of films from across the continent, something like 1,000 films. And we realized, okay, this is way too much. So we thought, let's just focus on Djibril Diop Mambety and Ousmane Sembene. 18 films is enough to begin to kind of think about two different generations of filmmakers in Senegal, but also about the tensions and projections that are often placed on them and how we might disrupt some of those ideas.
Yeah, so yes, I mean, now's the time perhaps to talk a little bit more or hear a bit more about Sembene and Mambety. So, you know, who they are, what their filmography consists of, and of course how the work lives in Mascon, the video you've made.
Yeah, Ousmane Sembene was born in the 1920s. He was a dock worker in the docks of Dakar and in Marseille, where he was injured and stopped working in the docks, joined the Communist Party of France. In the early 40s, he starts writing novels. He writes 6 brilliant novels. The first novel is called Le Docker Noir, Black Docker, about a dock worker who writes a novel, and the novel is then stolen from him by a white publisher who then publishes it under her own name. It's a brilliant first novel. And after running 6 novels, he retrains as a filmmaker. He travels to Moscow, learns all the arts and crafts of cinema, and he comes back, and in '64 he makes his first short film, which is called Borom Sarat, which is Wolof for cart driver. So it's what in those days would have been called a neo-realist film about a man driving a cart for hire.
With his donkey.
And his kind of travails, his troubles in his daily life and labour across the city of Dakar. Black and white film, brilliant 30-minute film. And Sembene carried on making films right through the 60s, right up until his final film in 2004, which is called Moulade, which is Wolof for sanctuary, which is a brilliant film about a woman who defends young girls who are being threatened with female genital mutilation. So it's a controversial and powerful feminist film, like many of his films. And Djibril Diop Mambety was born in the 1940s. He trained in theatre. He was a theatre maker. So he was a self-taught filmmaker. His first film, Badu Boy, or Contra City is actually his first film. It's a kind of irreverent guide around the city of Dakar, with him providing a very sarcastic voiceover. It's quite brilliant. He becomes famous for a film in 1972 called Tuki Buki, which is Wolof for Journey of the Hyenas, about 2 alienated teenagers who dream of leaving Dakar for Paris, and they scheme and plot and plan their way out of Dakar. And at the last minute, the teenage boy, Maury, changes his mind, backs out, doesn't go, and leaves Anta, his girlfriend, the student, to get on this ship and leave for Paris. His final film was made in the early 2000s. It's called The Little Girl Who Sold the Sun. It's about a little girl, a paraplegic girl with
crutches.
Yeah, who has to walk with these sticks.
Leg braces.
She has braces and she has to walk like this. And she's selling a newspaper called Le Soleil. It's a brilliant film. And these filmmakers are often posed against each other. Sembene is often posed as the so-called father of African cinema. He's often mischaracterized as a socialist realist, as a didactic, austere, sober filmmaker. whereas Mambety is characterized as a Dionysian, anarchistic, postmodernist, wild and free filmmaker. You know, that's a kind of exaggeration and a kind of crude account of their modes of analysis. And when you begin to study their films, you see how much they were in dialogue with each other across generations. And you begin to see how an actor who would appear in a Sembene film would appear in a Mambety film and vice versa. And so in our video Mascon, we're studying not so much the narratives, but we're creating a series of scenes that study certain recurring gestures and landscapes, bodies and spaces that you see across both of their works. We're creating something like a borderless world in which characters from different films meet in the plane of the image. We're creating a series of impossible meetings and impossible dialogues across films separated in time and space, which meet and create all kinds of hybridic combinations and impossible duets. And so Mascon is us trying to envision what a borderless cinema looks like by drawing on the work of these two great filmmakers.
I think it's also in relation to the borderless, this idea of an imaginary counterpower. You know, the kind of necrosis and the redundancy of the nation state as an imposition, you know, due to colonialism on Asia and on Africa. This, you know, worlds that were in dialogue with each other, that, you know, people could move across. Similarly with Europe and Asia, you know, this was one. Herodotus went to India, Thucydides went to India, Pliny went to India. My father came overland to the UK. As the world goes through the kind of death knells of the nation state, this horrible time that we're in now, this expansionist horrors are happening, the sense of that world of the nomad or the borderless world, the imagination of the wanderer, the itinerant nomad, is for us, I think, what really has produced all the things that we love in music and in art and in culture and in literature. And as we, I think, face a kind of feeling of an end time, I think we are more committed to the borderless imagination of counterpower more than ever. So I also, you know, when we think of cinema and our generation, if you're born in the 60s, you're born with the screen, you're born with music, you're born with headphones, you live a life of television and, you know, stereos. And your feelings and imagination is populated by fragments of films. For me, it's Battleship Potemkin was the first time I felt loss, you know, or, you know, past various different films. I'd be forced to watch art cinema by my parents. So this was when I was very young. But just in general, you know, you're brought up. The screen produces a different language, not just your parents, not just the language you learn, you know, in the world. The screen produces the language. And so I think it's our inheritance to kind of re-script that, you know, somehow with fragments. And this is very much what we are doing with this borderless imagination. We are populating, we are producing portals through surfaces from fragments that go through the films into scenes within scenes within scenes. And as an experiment.
Good.
Something on that. So, thinking about borderlessness
Mm.
and the way that film allows characters from different films across time and space to be in relation to each other, I'm curious to hear a bit more about the forms of the film essay here and the mural at the Art Institute, and how the mural relates to the film, and what those two different forms allow you to do, what kind of ideas you're able to put into tension by doing a quite similar project with these two different forms.
Yeah, the mural, when you first encounter it, is the imagination of scale is epic. It's 36 meters.
Squared.
Yeah. It's 3 horizontal, sections. And so the non-linearity of it is overwhelming. But in the process of making the film, it's actually extremely structured and organized according to certain schemas. There's a geometric schema in which we group images according to horizontality, verticality, diagonals, and circles. Then there are geographies, which we group together across the films, geographies of the desert, geographies of the Sahel being that, this kind of aridity, this zone of aridity that moves across north and west of the continent. Then there are the recurrence of actors. So the mural is really based according to large-scale schemas, which organize the structure. So when we look at it, that's what we're seeing. So the first encounter is multiple, but our encounter is schematic. And because there are arguments being made in the mural about the interruption of a certain reception of those filmmakers, and about opening up of a certain dimension of interpretation that people can look at these works again. So for us, that's what the mural is about. It's about a kind of structures. It's a kind of structural work. Above all, the mural is a visual study. Visual study is a term we take from the French film theorist Nicole Brenet, and she says it's about when you have a face-to-face encounter between an image and another image that is dedicated to studying that image. And that's what the mural is. The mural is an opportunity for us to study the work of Sembene and Mambety according to these schemas which we do not impose on the work, but which we draw from our study. We're not imposing anything. These things are in the work. We just attend to the work, draw out these ideas through an immanent methodology, and then use those immanent structures to organize everything. So the work of the mural has that organizational structure, and then when it comes to making this video, because we're dealing with the relation between stillness and movement and a certain kind of intermediate dimension of a still moving image. So we have 3 types of images: a still image, a moving image, and a still moving image. A still image which is in motion. So then this is still organized according to certain structures and schemas. We're still on the track of certain tropes, certain recurring images. But the aim is not so much to schematize, but to create a certain kind of liquidity. So that the method we're adopting is more to do with superimpositions and dissolves.
Cutouts.
And what we call camouflage. A camouflage is when a body disappears into a landscape. And the relation between a body and a landscape, a figure and a space, we're trying to create a continuum between body and space rather than making the body isolate itself in relation to a space. So I would say this is about continuities and continuums. The mural is about schemas and structures, but they are both forms of visual study, but they each require different ways, and they each demand different kinds of analysis.
And I would say that when our editor came, and we've been working with him for 18 years, his name's Simon Arazi, and he came and he said, I said, well, this is, going to be, I showed him all the material, and I said, I want to activate this dialogue between the moving image and the cutout. How do we get to the cutout, the still? And I said, this is going to be difficult. He said, no, this is exactly what's going to be fun, is the challenge of making a film from a mural. Some moving image artists might take stills from their films. And that's something we've never wanted to ever do. It's for us more exciting to go into the image production as as was defined by the mural, and just give it another space. In fact, we could have gone on and on and on with this. We could have made it 2 hours or 3 hours. It could have been a longer derive, but it's this relation between motion and the cutout. Rachel.
Brilliant. Sure.
Since I heard you guys talk a little earlier, earlier you talked about the concept of Pan-Africa into borderlessness into this film. And I know we talked about borderlessness, but would you guys want to zoom out just a little bit and tie it into the Pan-Africa kind of umbrella that we've been working on?
Sure. Very briefly, the idea of Pan-Africanism is often dismissed as a dream or a fantasy, but actually Pan-Africanism is to do with the theory and the practice of liberation, the liberation of specific countries from colonial rule, and then secondly, the unification of those countries in the interest of a borderless continent. So first you liberate the nation, and then you dissolve the borders of that nation in the interests of a borderless continent in which the questions of currency and the questions of militarization are not they're not siloed or sequestered within the borders of a nation, they're spread out across a nation. So what that requires is a certain expansion of a political imagination, because you're moving beyond the question of national liberation to the question of continental liberation. And the liberation of the continent would require the transformation of the world, because it would be changing the balance of power. That's why Lumumba had to be murdered by the Belgians and the CIA and the Americans and the British, because the Congo, Ghana, Mali, and Guinea were forming a nucleus of what would become a United States of Africa, which had implications for the economics and politics of the continent and therefore of the planet. So Pan-Africa was a serious threat to the imperial system of the 1950s and 1960s as it existed then. So if Pan-Africanism entails an expansion of a political horizon, it also entails an expansion of a kind of aesthetic imagination of what is possible, what is thinkable, and it's a kind of imagination of scale in which you move from the imagination of the nation to the imagination of the continent to the imagination of the planet. So that's what's at stake in the question of Pan-Africanism. And our argument is that we can see this at work in the artistic production of the 1950s and 1960s. And so cinema then becomes a place and a space where you can see that work of the expansion of a political horizon you can see that cultural imagination being played out. You can see it at work. And so that's part of why we turn to these films by these filmmakers. And that's also why we approach them in the ways we do. So we're not making a documentary on the life and work of these filmmakers. We are trying to take their existing historical images and give them a certain, what we call a kind of unbounded temporary orbit, so that they start to travel and they start to migrate and they travel out of their date. So an image from the 60s is a 60s image, but it isn't circumscribed by its date in 1964. On the contrary, it's on the move. And so we are opening up an intertemporal dimension, a dimension between times and a dimension between scales. And that is another way of characterizing what the mural and the video have in common. They are both attempting to put this question of the intertemporal and the question of the interscalar on the map. And these days, we don't even use the word essay film so much anymore. We think of our work in terms of interscalar vehicles, which are vehicles in which a research question and a medium travels between scales and opens up an imagination of a movement between scales and the kinds of claims you can make as you change your scale of analysis and your scale of inquiry. And that's probably a good way of thinking about both of these works. They are both interscalar vehicles. Thank you.
We're at 30 minutes, just
Done.
But
That's,
we can, yeah.
I think this is fantastic, and very helpful to me too, to get this kind of level of context. I do have a quick question, if we could go one more.
Of course.
We didn't get that far into the inspiration for the title Mascon, and I know it's rooted in Stephen Henderson's work. And I wonder if you can just get on record your thinking in relation to Henderson.
I'll start.
I mean, Mascon, it sounds,
You want to go?
yes. I mean, it's a funny title, and it's an interesting thing, I think, to have this duet between these two works. But Kojo can talk a little bit more about the genesis of the titles, maybe. But I was just going to say that Mascon kind of sounds like a sort of strange weapon, some kind of, you know, rocket launcher or some such evil technology. But in fact, with our work, it's the reverse of an evil weapon.
Yeah. So Stephen Henderson, you know, a great African-American literary theorist, in the early 70s, he's surveying the grand sweep of experimental African-American poetics, and he's charting tendencies. And he's looking at that moment in time when poetry is taking the measure of free jazz, poetry trying to evoke the kinds of experiments that Coltrane and Isla and Sun Ra and Cecil Taylor have been working with. Like, what would a poetry be that is trying to evoke the kinds of extended improvisations of John Coltrane? And in understanding that, he comes up with this formulation, which he borrows from NASA, of this notion of a mass concentration, a massive concentration. But he applies that NASA terminology to what he calls black experiential energy. He's trying to capture certain words, certain ideas, certain notions, which are loaded down with the energy of lived experience in America at that moment. And that seemed a very compelling formulation, not least because it kind of enacts what it's analyzing. Like, Mascon is already a compression of massive concentration. So even at the level of it, the first encounter, it's already doing that work. So the question is, you know, if we adopt that term and then adapt it for the present, what becomes thinkable when we add that notion of massive concentration of black experiential energy to the questions of the interscalar and the intertemporal that really animate a lot of the work that we've been doing over the past few years. And so it's a question we're posing rather than the question we're answering. Like, to bring Mascon into relation with those other themes invites a kind of density, a kind of theoretical density, and a kind of aesthetic thickness that we want from our work. It's as Anjali would say, it's a portal. It's a title that hangs there. So we hope it initiates curiosity. People ask themselves, what's going on with that term? And they look at the poster here in the Neubauer, that's also, in the Neubauer, that's also a mysterious image. What's going on with those people made up of, they look like they're made of sand. What's going on there? So there's a title that is asking a question of you, and there's an image whose provenance and whose outline are not immediately legible. So with those two levels of curiosity, we hope to pull people into the world of the work and to invite them to dwell a while in that work.